He had returned from Shanghai at 2:07 a.m., tie loosened, face stone set beneath the chandelier's milky glow, when the glass slipped from her damp fingers and shattered like a small, startled cry across the Carrara marble floor. The sliver-laced silence that followed was so complete that even the night, thick with February rain, seemed to hold its breath as Lucian Vale stared at the maid and saw not a person, but a flaw, not a mistake, but an offense, while Mara felt the blood drain from her face and the old instinct to apologize curl up, thin and frightened, at the back of her throat, because in this house, finely tuned cruelty had the elegance of a metronome, and everything, errors, grief, fear, was accounted for in the precise ledger of his power. He stepped closer, the scent of bergamot and jet lag on him, and his words came low, clipped, a reprimand engineered to bruise without leaving a trace. Yet when her apology finally broke loose, it only seemed to widen his contempt, and the world inside her tilted as he seized her wrist, not hard enough to fracture, but hard enough to warn, and she tasted the metallic sting of humiliation as he told her this house had no room for incompetence, no room for the scattered imprint of anyone but himself, and in the echo of his voice, she heard a bell tolling for the version of herself that still believed endurance was a kind of safety. The butler looked down, studying an invisible thread on his cuff as if empathy could be excused by choreography, while a guard at the far door shifted, gaze glassy with compliance. The shards under Mara's shoes made an eerie constellation, some tiny, some crescent, one like a tear, each remnant reflecting the chandelier's rain of light in fractured, trembling blades. She thought inexplicably of the mirror she had left in a small room in a smaller town, a mirror with a hairline crack down the right side that had somehow made her feel less alone, and the thought pierced her with a sudden absence too big to name. Lucian leaned in so close that she could count the silences his mouth had learned to command, and he called her insignificant, called her replaceable, called her a danger to order, as though the world was a ballroom floor upon which only he was permitted to dance without stepping on broken things. She whispered that she would pay for the glass, she would work late, she would do anything, and it struck her, even as she said it, that she was still bargaining with storms. He released her wrist, and the heat of his hand remained like a brand, not on the skin but in the story she kept telling herself about what it took to survive. "Clean it," he said, voice cool as a banker's pen, and turned away as if dispatching weather. The room exhaled again, timidly, and she crouched with the broom, gathering brightness into the dustpan, and the floor reflected her face back to her in wobbled fragments, an accidental portrait of someone who had become so small she could fit between the seconds of another man's impatience. Once, she had believed that pain was currency and obedience, the exchange rate, and perhaps that was why she had lasted 7 months on Vale Hill. The guard, whose name she didn't know, took one half-step forward, then changed his mind, and she felt the thin wire of anger hum at the base of her skull. Not loud, not yet, but steady, like a machine warming to its function. By the time she finished, the clock in the foyer read 2:29, the rain more insistent, the house cotton thick with silence. She carried the dustpan out through the service corridor, past the framed photographs of fundraisers where Lucian's smile had the crisp, lacquered sheen of a promise that would never be kept. She knew which bins to use, which door to leave ajar to prevent the latch from whining, which tiles near the pantry had a tiny rise that a foot could find in the dark. Knowledge, she had learned, was a map you carried under your skin when the world insisted you were lost. In the pantry, she washed the dustpan twice and dried it with a cloth kept only for that purpose, because the head housekeeper believed in invisible order most urgently of all. When Mara returned the broom to its hook, her hand trembled and then steadied itself, a small rebellion reclaimed. At 3:01, in the tiny room behind the laundry chute that they called a rest space, she sat on a chair with a wobble in one leg and pressed her wrist against her chest, the pulse quick beneath the lingering ache. If she closed her eyes, she could still hear the glass surrendering to gravity, the crystalline gasp that had given him an excuse. She thought of the date, February 16th, 2022, and the cruel neatness of anniversaries, because 2 years earlier to the day, something else had shattered, and she had been told to sweep that up too. She breathed in the scent of detergent and steam and let the memory come, not as punishment, but as proof that she was still here, still carrying the map that would someday lead her out. When dawn paled the city a soft, exhausted gray, she returned to the kitchen to prepare the breakfast tray that would go to the terrace no matter the weather, because wealth did not negotiate with clouds. She constructed the tray with the precision of someone laying down the first words of a confession. Steel-cut oats at 2 o'clock, blueberries at 4, French press-centered, napkin folded with a diagonal showing, the monogram and arrow pointing toward the mouth of someone who believed he could eat the sun and not burn. She carried it up the servants' stairs, each step a measured refusal to stumble, and when she set it down, Lucian did not look at her, only at his phone, the light of the screen making his face resemble a cave lit from within by a cold fire. "The board at 9, he murmured to no one in particular. "Sell the Penfield shares at open, and then, after a beat, replace kitchen staff." The words landed with the quiet force of a verdict. She kept her face smooth, a lake pretending not to have known storms. "Yes, Mr. Vale," she said, and the sound of her own voice surprised her with its calmness, as if a stranger had stepped in to speak for her and refused to tremble. He glanced up, and for a flicker she saw a man who had once wanted to be a boy, unafraid, but the flicker went out and the mask returned, efficient and incurious. She withdrew, and in the hallway, she leaned her forehead briefly against the cool frame of a window where rain braided itself into thin silver roads. The city breathed beyond the glass, unbroken by his name. She thought of streets where her feet could go without permission. The head housekeeper found her by the linen closet, eyes studying her with the practiced care of someone who had made a habit of knowing where every fragile thing was about to fail. "He will forget by lunch," the woman said, not unkindly. "They always do when there is money to hunt." The words were meant to soothe, and Mara caught the shape of the intention and put it in her pocket. "I won't," she answered, surprising them both, and then she smiled, a small, private, disobedient smile that felt like tasting rain after a long fever. The housekeeper's mouth twitched with something like respect, then settled into the familiar vigilance that kept the mansion from confessing how often it wanted to fall apart. At 8:42, Mara stood by the side entrance, watching black cars gather like intentions at the base of the steps. The board would come, men and women with faces crafted to spend concern without ever becoming poor. She thought of the ledger in Lucian's study, the one that disguised itself as art with hand-stitched binding, and of the passwords she had seen typed in the reflections of glass. The city had taught her to see around corners. She was, she realized, done trying to be smaller than the rooms she cleaned. The decision did not arrive as a shout, but as a quiet agreement with her own bones. Enough. Before lunch, she gathered her few things: a book with pages worn thin by fingers, a photograph of a woman whose lack of smile was a fierce kind of love, a key with no matching lock, and placed them in the canvas tote she kept wedged behind a loose baseboard. She wrote a note that said simply, "The glass broke, and so did the lie," and left it under the sugar canister where no one would think to look until sweetness was required. In the mirror above the sink, her face seemed to belong to someone, older and also to someone new. She smoothed her hair, an ordinary gesture that felt like rehearsing for a stage where she would no longer be cast as furniture. At 11:55, she took a breath, straightened her back, and walked out through the door used for deliveries, because leaving, she thought, was a kind of arrival. She did not look back at the mansion as she descended the steps and felt the city air touch her like a benediction. Every block softened the heat of his hand on her wrist. Every crosswalk unspooled from under her feet like a ribbon being reclaimed. The rain had gentled into mist, a kindness she accepted with exposed face. At the corner of Avenue B and 73rd, a bus hissed and a boy laughed and a dog tugged at its leash, as if the whole world had been conspiring to show her how much living was happening beyond the geometry of his rooms. She turned toward downtown with no plan except not to be afraid of the space her body took up. Somewhere, in the high glass skull of Vale Hill, a meeting was beginning, and she smiled because the city did not know his name, but it already knew hers. In the months before she first climbed the service stairs of Vale Hill, Mara had learned to count money by what it could not buy, It could not buy back the job her mother lost the spring the textile factory closed with the brown notice pinned like a wound on the chain-link fence. It could not buy the way the landlord's voice softened when he said they would have to go by the 31st. It could not buy the chemotherapy that had been promised in pamphlets and shrugged away in clinics where the clock seemed to tick only for other people. She remembered dates the way some people remembered hymns. April 12th, eviction notice. May 3rd, last day at the pharmacy. June 14th, the night a man offered her a ride and the stars above the strip mall hid their faces. And each date placed another careful stone on the cairn of who she was becoming, a person who did not confuse politeness with safety. She was 19 when she learned the shorthand of the city. 3 buzzes meant a delivery, 5 meant trouble, 1 long ring meant the landlord. She cleaned hotel rooms on 43rd for $11.75 an hour, discovered that the messiest guests tipped the most, that orchids died slowly and quietly, that sheets could tell stories that would never be published. On Mondays, she volunteered at a food pantry on Orchard where Mrs. D'Angelo called her kiddo and slipped her bruised peaches, saying bruised did not mean broken. The pantry kept a log, and in red pen, Mara wrote the number of loaves distributed, 47, then 52, then 63, as the prices rose on the register screens like a tide no one remembered signing up for. The first time she saw Vale Hill was from the back of a rideshare car whose driver pretended not to notice her counting folded bills in her lap to make sure she could cover the fare. The mansion rose from its cliff like a hand saying, "Stop to the river below," windows glinting, the drive curving with the arrogance of silk. "People live there?" she asked, not meaning the logistics, but the metaphysics of it. And the driver laughed, said, "People collect there," and turned up the radio so that the city could reassert itself as music. 2 months later, the agency called, "Live-in house staff, room provided, background check clear, you start Friday." And the word provided felt like a rope thrown to someone who had learned to swim only by drowning slowly and refusing to sink. Her mother, who measured advice in teaspoons and never left a recipe as written, had said, "Make yourself useful in any room and you will be invited back." And Mara stitched that into her pocket beside, "Keep your own name clean no matter how dirty theirs are." The first week at Vale Hill, she learned to fold napkins into water lilies, to polish silver without ever seeing her face reflected whole, to step around conversations that moved like invisible furniture. The head housekeeper, Salma, spoke in declarative sentences that clicked into place like well-fitted drawers, and Mara admired her until admiration slid into an ache at how much a spine could carry without cracking. She noticed small things, that Lucian Vale preferred his coffee poured to the millimeter under the rim, as if abundance offended him, that his schedule was printed at exactly 8 hours each night, and no one was allowed to tape it to the wall crooked, that in photographs taken before his wife's disappearance, he smiled with the left side of his face, and after, with none at all. The staff told 2 versions of that absence, one where she left of her own hunger for quiet, one where quiet was imposed upon her the way winter imposes itself upon a garden, and in both versions Lucian went on collecting, as the driver had said, anything that could be made to mean him. It was in late autumn that the first insult arrived wrapped in silk and signed with a tip. A guest called her sweetheart, and then shouted when the Cabernet was 1 degree warmer than his preference. "I don't make the wine," she said under her breath, and Salma heard, and later in the linen room said, "We do make the weather here, though, and it is safest when it is calm." And Mara understood, and also did not, because the world outside was a storm that was swallowing people's Thursdays whole, and inside it felt obscene to pretend that rain was an avoidable accident. On December 3, 2021, around the time the river decided to be ice for a week, Mara slipped on the stone steps carrying out trash and bruised her hip a plum purple. She did not tell anyone because pain had always seemed to her like a language you did not speak aloud unless you wanted someone to rewrite your story without your permission. She worked around the ache, moving like a person learning the steps to a dance she had never wanted to perform. Lucian passed her in the hall that day, his phone, a lighthouse for a ship he was steering only toward himself, and said, "Careful, the stairs are unforgiving," as if stairs could forgive what men refused to. Her first Christmas at Vale Hill did not smell like cinnamon, but like polish and rain. The staff ate leftovers in a small room with a clock that ticked too loudly, and someone told a joke that was not very funny but made them feel like conspirators against the scale of the house. Mara sent her mother a money order for $300 and a letter written on stationery meant for place cards, saying she was fine, the work was honest, the hours long. She did not write the part where sometimes she dreamed the house was a throat and she was a word it could not clear. She met a gardener named Theo, who taught her the names of trees as if they were friends: sycamore, copper beech, katsura, and the habit of noticing roots made her think differently about who she was. He smoked only when it snowed, said the cold made the smoke look like it had something to confess. Once, he said, he wasn't always like this, nodding toward the main house, and Mara waited. Or maybe he was and the world gave him a stage, he added, and flicked ash into a white silence that received it without judgment. On January 27th, she found a small notebook wedged behind a stack of old menus in the butler's pantry. Inside, clean handwriting cataloged donations like prayers. 2017, $2,000 to Youth Harbor. 2018, $50,000 to Vale Education Fund. 2019, $0. 2020, $0. 2021, $0. And the years without gifts made the earlier numbers feel like flowers left on a grave. In the back, a page torn out, edges like teeth. She wondered who had kept such a record and why, and something like a compass needle she had not known was still working inside her shivered toward north. The night before the broken glass, a storm had sheared across the river with a violence that felt personal, and the mansion responded the way rich things often do, by pretending nature was an inconvenience rather than a law. Mara lay awake counting seconds between lightning and thunder, counting breaths, counting the number of times she had bitten back the word no and mistaken the taste for virtue. Sleep was a gate that refused her entry, and when the call came to prepare the late tea service for a delayed arrival from Shanghai, she stood too quickly and saw stars, then steadied herself with a hand on the wall, the plaster cool and indifferent. She brewed the tea to the exact temperature remembered from Salma's lesson. No rolling boil, listen for the first sigh. And when she carried the tray past the hall, where the portrait of Lucian's father glowered like a weather system, she imagined crossing that threshold as another person, the kind who could unhang history and set it gently on the floor to rest. In the kitchen, a junior chef named Jada was closing up, and she whispered, "You okay?" in the tone of someone who knows okay is a precarious bridge we all pretend is a highway. Mara nodded, and the nod meant both no and I will be. The moment of the fall, the glass slick with condensation, her fingers damp, the tilt, gravity a patient accountant, unspooled in her head as if filmed and rewound, while the words he spoke replayed with their own particular cruelty. Replaceable, he had said, and her past rose up to argue with him on her behalf. She was the only child who had remembered to turn off the gas on nights her mother was too tired, the only clerk at the pharmacy who had memorized the names of the regulars and the way they preferred to be seen, the only person at the shelter who could quiet the dog with the nervous bark using nothing but the warmth of her hand and her patience. Replaceable sounded like a prayer to those who fear their sins might be unique. After she left the mansion, her feet seemed to make decisions for her, and she followed them as if they were wiser than her head. She walked south along the river where the water lifted and settled like the chest of something large asleep. She passed a newsstand where headlines barked about market volatility and an artist who had glued feathers to his car. She bought a black coffee for $2.25 from a vendor who spoke to her with the uncomplicated kindness of someone who knew that morning was already hard work. The cups steamed in her hands and felt like a small hearth she had earned. She reached a public library at 12:14 and went inside because books had always been the only rooms where she could enter without asking permission. The stacks smelled like dust and rain and the stubbornness of people who kept coming back to ask questions. She sat at a computer terminal, fingers hovering above keys as if over a body of water she was ready to enter. The screen blinked expectantly, and she typed, Lucian Vale Foundation Donations Lapse 2019, 2020, 2021, and then Vale Hill Labor Violations, and then Whistleblower Protection New York 2022. and with each search she felt the old wire of anger tune itself to a clearer frequency. The librarian, a woman with silver hair pinned with 2 blue pencils, noticed her intensity and asked if she needed help. "I need to know what happens when you stop apologizing," Mara said, only half joking, and the woman smiled like a door opening. She showed Mara how to access archived filings, how to read nonprofit 990s, how to follow the thread of a company through shell entities that replicated like mirror reflections. "It isn't illegal to be unkind," the librarian said softly, "but sometimes the unkindness is a cover, sometimes it is a smoke machine," and Mara nodded because she could still smell the machine. At 3:37, Mara printed 10 pages, public data, open secrets, small numbers with big shadows, and tucked them into her canvas tote beside the book and the photograph and the lockless key. She looked at the pages and found not proof, not yet, but the beginnings of a story that might refuse to be contained by the boundaries of his name. She wrote down a phone number for a legal aid clinic that accepted walk-ins on Thursdays, and a journalist's email she found attached to a 2020 piece about wage theft. On construction sites, the librarian circled the relevant addresses as if drawing a map through a forest she had already survived. She rented a room by the week in a building where the hallway smelled of cumin and floor cleaner, where on Tuesdays a man practiced the trumpet 2 floors down, and the song, though not yet good, carried a sincerity that steadied her. She paid cash, filled out no forms, and slept for 6 hours with the window cracked, even though it was cold, because she needed the city to keep speaking to her while she dreamed. When she woke, she measured her resolve like cloth and cut it into the shape of a decision. She would not go back. She would go forward, and if forward required light, she would learn to make it. The next morning, February 17th, she wrote a list in a cheap notebook she had bought from a bodega. 1. Legal aid clinic. 2. Email journalist. 3. Gather staff testimonies. 4. Document schedules. 5. Check procurement contracts. 6. Don't be afraid. Under number 6, she drew a small box and checked it, not because fear was gone, but because it had finally agreed to ride in the back seat. She dressed in jeans and a sweater that still held the faint scent of the laundry at Vale Hill, a smell she told herself would fade if given enough honest air. At the clinic, she sat in a waiting room with chairs that had been repaired with bright tape, as if someone believed broken things should not be punished for being themselves. A volunteer took her name and asked, "Are you safe?" And the question arrived like rain in a dry country. "I am safer than I was yesterday," she answered, and meant it. When the attorney called her in at 10:22, he listened without impatience, interrupted only to clarify dates and to ask whether she had kept copies of schedules and messages. "You may not be the first," he said, "but you could be the one who puts the last stone on the scale." And she thought of all the stones she had been carrying and felt the odd lightness of setting one down where it might matter. Courage did not present itself as a banner, but as a ritual. Each morning she wrote down 3 things that frightened her, and 3 she would do anyway. Day 1. Call Jada. Call Theo. Call Salma. The calls felt like stepping into a room she could not fully see. Jada answered first, her voice a quick drummed heart. "Are you okay?" And Mara said, "I left." And then, after a breath, "I'm going to tell the truth." And the line went quiet the way people go quiet when they are rearranging their ideas of what is possible. "I'll meet you," Jada said, and named a cafe at 14th and Pine where the scones were too sweet and the staff wore their aprons like armor. Theo came next, and his reply was simple and steady. "I've kept a notebook," he said, surprising her. "Dates, over time. The time he told Miguel to stop pretending your back hurts. It's not carrying anything important. The day the pesticide order got doubled even though we told them it was making us sick. I thought it would be useless until it wasn't." And she closed her eyes because hope had a physical weight, and she was learning how to carry it. Salma was last, and her silence was the longest, deep with fear and the history of having survived by being invisible. Finally, she said, "Meet me at St. Bridget's at dusk, the back pew, no names," and hung up in a way that sounded like a prayer and a dare. The cafe hummed with the ordinary bravery of people using their lunch break to stay human. Jada slid into the booth, eyes fierce, hair tucked under a beanie, hands shaking only until they found Mara's. "I'm in," she said, before the coffee arrived. "I'm so tired of measuring myself with his tape, of pretending my worth is a decimal he moves with his mouth," and Mara laughed, a surprised, small, delighted sound that made the elderly couple at the next table look over and smile as if remembering something alive. They compared notes. They listed names. They decided to ask people without asking too much, to be careful with the parts of others that had been taught to fear their own reflection. At St. Brigid's, dusk stained the nave a kind of blue that made everything appear briefly beloved. Salma sat in the last pew as promised, hands wrapped together like a parcel she was not sure it was legal to carry. "He will bring lawyers," Salma said without greeting, "and those men wear their suits like skin. You must be prepared for their questions to be knives that look like spoons." And Mara nodded, because she had learned to recognize hunger even when it was dressed as dinner. Salma reached into her bag and withdrew a thumb drive, small as a secret, and placed it in Mara's palm. "Schedules, notes. The night he told me to erase the overtime column because loyalty is its own payment, and the payroll software company's email asking if we were sure about the changes. I am tired of making sure only his comfort is correct." At home, Mara plugged the drive into the library computer because she trusted its distance, the way public machines spread risk the way oceans spread salt. She opened folders named with unremarkable words, inventory, rota, pantry, and found within them a choreography of theft. Time erased, breaks shortened, hazard pay recategorized as holiday goodwill, procurement contracts awarded to companies with PO, boxes that matched those of shell nonprofits connected to a Vale family office. She printed sparingly, she took notes, she photographed the screen, she learned the grammar of corruption and found it banal and therefore more dangerous. On February 22nd, she sent the email to the journalist whose archive had crackled with the kind of electricity that starts fires in the right places. The subject line read, "Documented wage theft, plus procurement fraud at Vale Hill, witnesses and files," and her finger hovered over send the way a diver hovers at the edge of a high rock. She pressed it, and in the soft click, she heard the sound of a door locking behind her and another door opening ahead. The reply came faster than she had told herself to expect. "Can meet tomorrow 10 a.m. Bring copies, we'll talk protection." And the word protection tasted like water when you were nearly too tired to swallow. Lucian, meanwhile, went about his days as if the house were a stage and the city only an audience. He sold Penfield at open and told the analyst to mark the sale opportunistic rather than reactive. He rehearsed for a panel on responsible innovation, scheduled for March 3rd at a hotel where the chandeliers looked like declarations of war. He called his property manager to say the tenants in Building C should be reminded of the value of gratitude, after they asked for heat on a night that reached 19 degrees. He did not think of the maid except as a small absence that would be filled by another body, a plug for a leak he refused to admit existed. On the 24th, the journalist, Ari Mendoza, with a sharp kindness in his eyes and a notebook already open, asked questions that felt like invitations rather than traps. "Tell me the story as if you were telling it to yourself," he said. And she did. And when she finished, he said, "I believe you," in a tone that brought the ceiling down a few inches closer to her head, making the room feel like something she could reach the top of with her fingers. They discussed corroboration, timing, the choreography of safety. "We will fact-check until it sings," Ari said, and the metaphor surprised them both into a brief, grateful silence. Mara spent the next days gathering voices. A dishwasher named Rogelio who kept pay stubs in a shoebox under his bed. A groundskeeper who had been told his headaches were attitude problems until a clinic in the Bronx found pesticide exposure. A security guard who had been a teacher in another country and now watched doors and learned the tempered art of not watching too much. They spoke in cautious rooms. They spoke outside with the wind covering their words. They spoke into her recorder with the modest courage of people who know they are often ignored by those who are not. She kept their names clean in her notes. She kept their trust like flame cupped in her hands. There was a night, February 28th, when doubt came to sit on the edge of her bed like an uninvited aunt, and it listed for her all the ways in which the world tolerated men like Lucian because they made money multiply. She listened, because doubt, like pain, had saved her before. And then she spoke back, quietly, but with precision. I am not doing this because I will win. I am doing this because truth is a thing that should be allowed to breathe. And she slept. And in the morning she woke and wrote under number 6 on her list, "Fear is information, not a command," and checked the box again, this time with a small star. March came in the way it often does in cities that think they can negotiate with weather. It pretended warmth and then punished gullibility. Mara wore layers and patience and walked to the legal clinic with a folder that had begun to feel like a living thing. The attorney explained retaliation statutes, free speech protections for matters of public concern, strategies for media release that would minimize the window in which Lucian's team could learn and move. "You are building a raft," he said. "We are checking for holes." And she felt less like a person drowning and more like a person learning to understand rivers. The confrontation began with a subpoena and ended with a microphone. In between, there was the specific terror of being seen by the man who had taught you to stay small, and the specific relief of refusing to be smaller than your own name. Ari's piece went live at 6:02 a.m. on March 7th, with documents embedded and voices given room to be themselves. The headline did not scream, but spoke with the even clarity of someone reading a ledger. Inside Vale Hill, wage theft, sham contracts, and the price of silence. And within an hour, the story had been shared enough times that the mansion, which had treated attention like a trophy, found it edging into the room like smoke. Lucian read the piece at his gym, where the mirrors had been designed to flatter, and for the first time in a long time, his reflection did not obey. He threw his towel into a hamper with more force than necessary, called his general counsel, reached for phrases that had always worked. Disgruntled former employee? We take these allegations seriously. Internal review already underway? And did not realize that the shape of the world had moved a centimeter out of his favor. He told his, assistant to find out who did this. And she, who had grown tired of typing orders that paid for apartments she no longer liked to sleep in, replied, "The byline is right there, sir," and hung up by mistake, or perhaps on purpose. At noon, a local news crew stood outside the gate, the wind rearranging their hair and the questions rearranging Lucian's schedule. He came out with his suit like armor and his smile like a blade and said, "We categorically deny," and "We are proud of our people," and "We will litigate." And someone shouted, "What do you say to Mara?" And his eyes made a small, involuntary movement, like an animal checking a trap. "Who?" he said. And the lie was so ordinary that it astonished people into listening harder. In the afternoon, a group of staff, led by Salma, who wore her best coat as if to court, stood on the sidewalk with signs in careful handwriting. "Honest work deserves honest pay, and we are not a line item, and we kept your house." A woman from a tenants' union handed them a bullhorn with the gentleness of handing a baby to its parent. Mara did not take the bullhorn. She took the second row, held a sign, and felt the tremor in her forearms become steadiness. The city noticed because the city remembered being told once too often to keep quiet while other people counted. The board of Vale Holdings convened an emergency meeting by video, faces in neat squares pretending to be in the same room. One director cleared his throat as if that could clear the matter. Another suggested a temporary distancing, and a third asked whether the numbers mattered more than the narrative. Lucian listened and thought of the portrait of his father, and of the day he learned that money, when piled high enough, could be mistaken for a mountain no one would dare to climb. He said, "We will sue." And they said, "We will see." And it was the first time in a long time a sentence had returned to him lighter than he had sent it. That evening, a town hall was held at the community center on 109th, where the walls wore murals of hands passing light from one to another. Ari moderated. The legal aid attorney sat at the end. Salma spoke first, voice low and sure, naming dates, naming the way the overtime had been scraped off like icing from a cake reserved for someone else. Jada told the story of the kitchen staff's hours during the pandemic, how they had cooked for guests who flew in for private dinners while hospitals ran. Out of gloves, and the room made the sound of people being pushed and then pushing back. When it was Mara's turn, she stood and felt for a moment the old urge to apologize arrive out of habit, like a stray cat returning to a door it had once been fed at. She did not open the door. "I am not here for revenge," she said, and her voice surprised her by not shaking. "I am here for accuracy. I am here because there is a line between justice and vengeance, and I have been walking it with my eyes open. I do not want his life, I want mine, and I want everyone who kept his life running to have theirs without having to surrender their dignity at the door." And the room, which had been holding its breath, let it out. A woman in the back raised her hand and said, "What if nothing changes?" And Mara answered honestly, "Then we will have told the truth, and the truth will sit in the room and make it harder for lies to stretch out comfortably. And we will come back tomorrow and tell it again. Change is a habit, not a miracle." And someone near the front wiped their eyes and nodded as if counting reasons to keep going. The attorney outlined next steps. The journalist promised follow-ups. The union organizer collected names. And the night, which had arrived with a cold bite, seemed to ease its jar a little. Lucian, at home, poured a drink he did not finish, and walked the perimeter of his office like a general reviewing a battlefield that had begun to behave strangely. He pulled the ledger with the hand-stitched binding from the shelf and opened it as if it could still give him the reassurance of numbers behaving. He saw, instead, gaps that now looked like accusations. He closed the book and stared at the portrait of his father, who had once said, "If someone is looking at you, you control what they see," and realized for the first time that the sentence contained within it the seed of its own failure. The lawsuit arrived on March 10th, his name at the top, and then a comma, and then a list of corporate entities as if trying to hide his loneliness in a crowd. The claims were specific, the exhibits unglamorous, and therefore convincing. He released a statement in which he said the word baseless 3 times, as if repetition could render something true. His stock dipped 7% by close, a number small in certain contexts and seismic in others. The producer of the panel on responsible innovation called to suggest a reschedule. The portrait of his father continued to watch in oils that could not change expression. Consequences did not fall like a guillotine. They accumulated like snow until roofs had to admit what they were holding. Inspections began at the properties on Riverside and Lenox, and tenants posted photographs of broken radiators and mold blooming like uninvited wallpaper. A procurement official in the city government, who had once put a Vail subcontract on a list by reflex, now raised an eyebrow and a red flag. Aries' second piece traced the shell companies with the delight of a good cartographer finding the coast where a map had pretended there was only sea. Donations that had been promised to the museum were paused, a verb that sounded like mercy and felt like ice. Inside the mansion, a strange quiet took hold. Salma implemented a schedule that did not ask anyone to be 2 places at once, and people breathed as if their lungs had remembered a forgotten dimension. The gardeners wore masks when they sprayed, and then, after Theo's notebook made its way to the right inbox, the spraying stopped altogether. The kitchen staff put a jar by the clock where anyone could slip in an anonymous note about how the day felt on a scale of 1 to 10, and the act of measuring made the days move differently. The butler, who had once studied invisible threads on his cuff to avoid choosing, looked up and began to choose. Mara, who had been the spark but refused to be the fire alone, took a job at the community center assisting with tenant workshops on Thursdays and youth writing labs on Saturdays. She taught the kids to write their names big and legible at the tops of their pages, to take up space in ink. She taught the tenants to keep receipts and write down dates, to learn the law the way one learns a dance, awkwardly at first, gracefully as courage becomes muscle memory. She went home tired in a way that felt honest, and she slept without bargaining with her own dream. Lucian's friends, the ones who had practiced loyalty as a lifestyle because it paid out well, began to cancel lunches, citing travel and the quarter. The invitations that arrived had a numbered quality, as if his name had slid down the guest list 9 places and was now in danger of falling off the page. He called an old mentor and found the line went to voicemail, and the voicemail had been recorded in a time when Lucian believed himself permanent. He poured himself another drink and did not finish that one either. and the crystal on the table looked in a certain angle of light, like apology. In late March, the judge denied his motion to dismiss with a paragraph that read like a teacher reminding a student that rules apply. The word plausible was used with a firmness that suggested the court would not be charmed by adjectives. In a separate envelope, the Attorney General's office requested documents with dates and specificity that made Lucian's scalp tighten. The house that had always performed solidity for him felt, for the first time, like a set built for a play whose run was ending. He walked its halls and heard his own footsteps as if performed by someone else. Mara received a letter in the mail with a return address she did not recognize. Inside was a check for $2,000 and a note in a careful hand. "For your mother's treatments. From someone who forgot too long how to be human." There was no signature. She cried, short and surprised. A weather event localized to her kitchen. She did not tell anyone because she did not want to make the giver's potential shame part of the story. She deposited the check, scheduled appointments, and sat with her mother through an infusion where the nurse wore earrings shaped like suns and told jokes that made science feel like tenderness. Ari called to say the national outlet wanted a follow-up with an op-ed in Mara's voice. She hesitated, then agreed, and wrote at the library on a Saturday when the trumpet, 2 floors down, found the right notes. She wrote about integrity and expedience, about justice and revenge, about the quiet courage of saying your own name in a room where someone powerful has been pronouncing it for you. She wrote, "I did not set out to ruin a man. I set out to stop a system from using people up and calling. The ashes, the cost of doing business." And when it published, people sent messages that read like small lanterns, and she placed them on her windowsill in the form of printouts and thanked each one in her head. On April 12th, a date she always remembered, she walked past Vale Hill on her way to meet Salma, who had asked for help drafting a statement from the staff. The gate was open to allow a truck to pass, and she paused, not at the threshold, but at the memory. She did not tremble. The guard at the gate was the same one who had shifted his weight the night of the glass, and he nodded to her, a small human bow. "Good afternoon," he said, and the ordinary politeness felt like an apology offered by the world on the world's own behalf. She nodded back and kept walking toward whatever would be next. The lasting losses for Lucian did not announce themselves with sirens. They arrived in quiet absences. The grant he could no longer give because the board demanded the numbers line up differently. The museum wing that would not bear his family name. The panel on innovation that proceeded without him as the moderator said, "Our scheduled guest could not be here." Perhaps that is in itself instructive. Worse than money, he lost the mirror he had once trusted, the one that had shown him a hero, when he was only rehearsing heroics. Now, when he looked, he saw someone who had mistaken fear for respect and silence for consent, and no amount of glass polishing could make that reflection obey. The court case crawled, as cases do, through motions and calendars and adjournments that respected no one's sense of urgency. In June, a settlement was proposed that demanded back pay, penalties, oversight, and apology. He balked at the last word, apology, and his attorney said, "It cost you less than the rest." And he said, "It costs me everything," revealing more than he intended about the currency he valued. The staff debated whether to accept, and Mara kept her voice in the middle, reminding them that the perfect is the enemy of both the good and the tired. They voted, and the vote was yes, and a check arrived that made a new kind of weather possible in their kitchens. On a humid evening in July, the community center held a celebration where the music was local, and the food was made by hands that knew spice-like language. Mara danced a little, badly, and did not care. Her mother, thinner but laughing, sat in a folding chair and clapped offbeat. Salma wore lipstick the color of a decision. Jada told a joke that was very funny this time. Theo, unusually solemn, gifted Mara a sapling in a pot, a katsura, that smelled faintly of burnt sugar when the leaves were crushed. "Plant it where you can see it," he said. "They grow heart-shaped leaves that fall golden in the fall. It is good to watch something grow that does not ask permission from any man's ledger." Lucian sent the apology, signed with his name and accompanied by the funds. It was printed in the paper as a condition and read aloud at the center as a ceremony. He did not attend. In his office, He read the words and felt them land on his desk like something alive. He wondered, briefly and too late, who he might have been if someone had interrupted his certainty earlier, if someone had told him that control is a poor substitute for intimacy, and that power hoarded is power that curdles. He turned off the light and sat in the dim, listening to the house settle into its new shape without asking his permission. Autumn returned with its disciplined beauty, and the katsura on Mara's windowsill outgrew its pot. She and Theo planted it in a small community garden plot that children had painted with stars. On September 15th, she wrote in her notebook, "Before, I made myself small to survive. After, I make myself present to live." And the sentence did not feel like an ending, but like a key that finally fit the lock she had carried for years. She began taking night classes in investigative accounting, not because she wanted to count other people's sins, but because she wanted to translate harm into numbers that systems could not ignore. The kids in the writing lab wrote stories where maids became queens, and billionaires learned to bake bread that did not taste like control. They asked her if heroes were always brave, and she told them, "Heroes are often scared and brave at the same time. The trick is to see fear as a flashlight, not a stop sign." One of them, a boy who missed the trumpet when he had to stay late at school, said, "Like how you used the broken glass as a window." And she laughed because metaphors, when offered by children, were more accurate than most reports. In December, snow came soft and late, and the community center held a memorial for those they had lost over the past years. Names spoken into a room that had learned to hold both grief and joy without confusing them. Mara stood and said her father's name, and then the names of people she had never met, but whose absence had shaped the world in small ways. Mrs. Price in 3B, who watered everyone's plants. Jamal, who always fixed bikes for free. The woman whose laughter had once filled the pharmacy. When she sat, the katsura leaves outside were gold, and the air smelled briefly, unbelievably, like sugar. On the second anniversary of the night the glass broke, she returned to Vale Hill not as staff, but as a guest of the staff, invited to a small ceremony where the jar by the clock was replaced by a framed photograph of everyone who had stayed and everyone who had left. The butler, now named aloud by everyone as Dev, shook her hand and said, "Thank you for choosing to be seen," and Salma hugged her, a rare thing that made Mara's ribs feel like a room expanding. Lucian was not there. His office was. Still, the portrait of his father had been moved to a less visible wall, and a print of a river had taken its place, water moving as water does, toward whatever carried it. She walked down the marble hall where, once, she had knelt to gather the shards of a glass and the shards of a lie. She paused, not to revisit, but to recognize. She imagined the shards still there, not as weapons but as mirrors, reflecting back a girl who had learned not to negotiate with storms. She smiled, a small, private, unrepentant smile, and stepped out into the cold, which greeted her with honesty. In the end, what she did when she left the mansion was not simply to expose a man, but to unmask a system, to place a weight on the scale and refuse to move until it registered. Lucian lost money, credibility, and the illusion that control is the same as love. Mara gained a life where her name did not have to wait its turn. The city did not become perfect, but it became, for a time, more precise, more reluctant to look away. And in a small garden, a tree learned to turn light into sugar and then release it into the air, so that in autumn, the whole block smelled like possibility, and people looked up from their worries and thought, for a moment, of the way truth, once spoken, sweetens what it touches.